The gate agent said the word delayed for the fourth time, and the whole terminal seemed to sag. Renee Carter heard it the way she heard everything that day, through a fog of arithmetic that would not stop running in her head. $41 in her checking account, a connecting flight she was now going to miss. A sister in Memphis who had said, "Come now, if you want to see Mama awake," and a clock that did not care how tired Renee was or how little money she had. She stood at the edge of the crowd with her son's small hand in hers and a duffel bag over her shoulder, and she did the things she had taught herself to do in waiting rooms and bus lines and the long fluorescent hours of a hospital cafeteria. She breathed in for 4 counts. She held it. She let it go. The terminal had the particular misery of a place built for leaving where no one was allowed to leave. A child 2 gates down had been crying in long, ragged pulls for half an hour, and his mother had stopped apologizing to the strangers around her, and Renee understood that surrender, the moment when you no longer have the strength to manage how your hardship looks to other people. A man in a suit kept asking the gate agent the same question in 3 different tones, as though the right tone might rebuild the plane. The vending machines glowed. A janitor pushed a dust mop in slow figure eights around the rows of bolted chairs, and Renee watched him work because she knew that work, the invisibility of it, the way people lifted their feet without looking up. She had pushed a cart like his for 2 years before the cafeteria job. She knew the weight of a shift that no one sees. Beside her, the man in the rumpled grey sweater watched her do it and said nothing. He had been watching her for almost an hour, though she had not noticed, because people like Renee learn early not to expect to be noticed. She was 34 years old, and she had spent most of those years being the woman nobody looked at twice, the one who refilled the coffee and emptied the bins and held the door and was thanked when she was thanked at all without anyone meeting her eyes. She did not know that the man in the grey sweater had $19 billion. She did not know his name was on the side of a building. She had walked past 1,000 times. She knew only that he looked tired too, and that he had given up his spot at the charging station so a teenager with a dead phone could use it, and that this small thing had made her trust him a little, the way you trust anyone who is kind when they think no one is keeping score. Stay with me here, because what happened on that delayed flight is the kind of thing people spend their whole lives waiting for and never believe when it finally comes. Her son was named Eli, and he was 6, and he was the reason Renee was standing in an airport at all. Eli had been born 8 weeks early, small enough to fit in 2 cupped hands, and the doctors had used words she did not understand, and a machine that breathed for him while she pressed her forehead to the glass of the incubator and made promises to God she intended to keep. She had stood at that glass for 31 nights. She remembered the number because she had counted them the way you count anything you cannot control, 1 tally mark at a time on the inside of her own ribs. The nurses had let her press 1 finger through the porthole in the plastic, and she had touched his foot, which was the size of her thumbnail, and the foot had curled around her fingertip with a strength that did not match its size. And that was the first thing Eli had ever told her about himself, that he intended to hold on. He had lived. He had grown into a boy who asked too many questions and loved the wrong cartoons and slept with 1 foot always hanging off the bed, as though even in sleep he was reaching for the edge of something. The early birth had left a mark on his heart, a small flaw in the wiring, and twice a year Renee took him to a specialist 3 states away, because the specialist 3 states away was the one her insurance would barely cover, and the one who had kept Eli alive once before. That was where they were headed now. On the cheapest flight she could find, 2 weeks before a surgery she had not yet figured out how to pay for. Her mother dying in Memphis was a grief she could not afford to fly toward. Her son's heart was a debt she could not afford to ignore. She had chosen the heart. She always chose the heart. The flight finally boarded 2 hours late, and Renee shuffled down the jet bridge with Eli yawning against her hip. She had booked the back of the plane, the last row before the lavatory, the seats nobody wants, the ones that do not recline and smell faintly of the thing behind the door. So she was surprised when the gate scanner chirped wrong and the agent frowned at her boarding pass and tapped at the screen and said, with the flat politeness of someone reading a system they do not control, that she had been moved. Renee's first thought was not relief. Her first thought was the thought of a woman who has learned that surprises are usually expensive. Moved where? She asked, her stomach already tightening, because moved usually meant bumped, and bumped meant a night in an airport she could not pay for. A missed appointment, a phone call to a specialist's office where the receptionist would sigh. The agent looked at the screen again. Up front, she said, 2 seats. First class. There must be a mistake, Renee said, and she heard her own voice go, careful. The way it went careful in any room where money was being discussed, and she was not sure she was allowed to want the thing she wanted. The agent shrugged in the way of a woman who had learned not to argue with mysteries that worked in a passenger's favor. No mistake, she said. Enjoy your flight. And she handed back the pass and looked past Renee to the next traveller, and the small door of the question closed. And Renee carried her son toward the front of a plane she had never been allowed to walk into before. Rainey did not know that the man in the grey sweater had quietly paid the difference 40 minutes earlier at a kiosk, with a card he kept in a worn leather wallet that did not match the price of anything inside it. The seats were wide and pale and smelled of someone else's cologne. There was a little dish for your watch and a screen the size of a book and a button that made the footrest rise, and Eli pressed every button twice and then pressed his face to the window and forgot to be tired. Renee sat very still at first, the way you sit in a house that is not yours, and she watched the people in the front of the plane to learn how they did it, how they let the attendant take their coats, how they did not say thank you for the water as though water were a gift. She decided she would say thank you anyway. And the man in the grey sweater, the one who had watched her breathe in the terminal, lowered himself into the aisle seat beside her with a small grunt and a tired smile and said, "That's a good boy you've got there." Renee said, "Thank you." She did not ask who he was. She would not ask, not once, across all the hours that followed, and that was the thing that changed everything, though she could not have known it then. His name was Walter Hesh, and 20 years ago he had been nobody too. He did not tell her that. He told her his name was Walter, just Walter, and that he was flying to the same city she was, and that he hated airports as much as she did. He had a way of asking questions that did not feel like prying. Small ones at first. Where are you headed? Is it your first time up front? Does the boy fly well? And he listened to the answers as though they were the only thing on the plane worth his attention. Renee noticed that. So many people ask questions the way they checked a box, already looking past you toward the door. Walter asked the way a man reads a letter he has been waiting for, slowly and twice. Somewhere over the second hour, with Eli asleep, across both their armrests and a thin blanket pulled to the boy's chin, Renee found herself talking. She did not mean to. She was not a woman who talked about herself. Yet Walter asked about Eli. And asking about Eli was the one key that turned every lock in her, and so she told him about the 8 weeks early, and the machine that breathed, and the small flaw in the wiring, and the surgery 2 weeks out. She told him about the specialist 3 states away and how she had found him years ago by calling 14 offices until one said yes. She told him that Eli had asked on the drive to the airport whether the doctors would make him a robot heart, and that she had said, "No, baby." To tune up, the same heart, only fixed, and that Eli had seemed disappointed. Walter laughed at that, a real laugh, low and surprised. And the laugh made Renee laugh too, and for a moment the cabin was just 2 tired people and a sleeping boy and the small warmth of a thing shared. She did not tell him about the $41. Some things a person keeps. She told him one more thing though, because the dark and the altitude loosened people. She told him that her own mother was dying in Memphis and that she was not going to make it there in time, and that she had made her peace with that the only way she knew how, which was to remind herself that her mother had taught her exactly this, that you go where the living need you before you go where the dying call you. Walter did not offer comfort. He did not say she was so sorry or the empty things people say. He just nodded slowly, and after a while he said that his own mother had cleaned other people's houses for 30 years and had died before he could buy her one of her own, and that he had learned too late that the buying was never the point, the being there was. Renee looked at him then, really looked. At the grey sweater and the worn wallet and the tired, kind face, and she thought he must have done all right for himself to be sitting up front, and she thought no more about it than that. What she did not know was that Walter Hesh had been listening for a story like hers for a long time, and that he had nearly given up on hearing one told the way she told it, without a single hand held out. The flight attendant came through with the warm cloths and the little dishes of nuts, and Renee watched Walter refuse the wine and accept the water and thank the young man by name, reading it off the badge, the way most people in those seats never bothered to. She filed that away. She noticed kindness the way other people noticed money, because kindness was the currency she had been paid in her whole life, and she had learned to tell the real from the counterfeit. Walter's was real. She did not know why a man flying first class would spend 3 hours talking to a hospital cafeteria worker and her sleeping son. But she had stopped expecting the world to explain itself, and she let the not knowing sit beside her like a third passenger, and made her peace with it. Across the aisle, a woman in a cream silk blouse had been watching them too, and what she saw did not please her. The woman's name was Diane Foll, and she was a senior vice president at a company whose name Renee would not have recognized, and she had spent the boarding process trying to catch Walter's eye, and failing, because Walter's eye was on the woman in the worn cardigan and the boy with one foot hanging off the seat. Diane had recognized Walter the moment he sat down. Of course she had. She had been in 3 meetings with him that quarter, had laughed at his jokes, had practiced his name in the mirror, and now here he was, on her flight, beside a woman who clearly had no idea who he was, and Diane could not understand it, and what we cannot understand we often decide to resent. She leaned across the aisle during the 3rd hour, when Renee got up to walk a stiff-legged loop to the lavatory, and she said to Walter in a voice pitched to be overheard, "You're very patient." Walter looked at her. Diane smiled, the smile of someone offering a shortcut. "Some people," she said, "they see a man like you and they latch on. You have to watch for it." I'm sure she has quite a story ready. Walter looked at her for a long moment, and the cabin lights had dimmed for the overnight leg, and in the half-dark his face was hard to read. Then he said, very quietly, "She hasn't asked me for a single thing." And he turned back to the window, and Diane sat back in her seat, with her cheeks warm, and the matter was closed, though she did not yet understand how thoroughly it had been closed against her. Renee came back down the aisle, and did not know any of it had happened. She slacked a little. Finally, somewhere over the dark middle of the country, her head tipping toward the window and then jerking upright, the way the tired sleep when they cannot afford to fully let go. Walter did not sleep. He watched the boy breathe, the small chest rising and falling, the foot that had worked its way free of the blanket again, and he reached over once carefully and drew the blanket back up, the way you do for a child who is not yours, but who has, in some way you cannot explain, become your responsibility for the length of a flight. He thought about a hospital 20 years gone and a different machine and a promise he had made to a woman who had not lived to see him keep it. He thought about all the money he had made since, and all the rooms full of people who knew his name, the galas and the boards and the long table where men in good suits said his first name as though they were old friends, and how none of them, not one, in 20 years had ever once failed to ask him for something before the night was over. He had built a life in which every conversation was a transaction he could see coming. And here, at 30,000 feet beside a woman in a worn cardigan who had told him about the best and worst things in her life and never once reached for his sleeve, he felt like a man who had been thirsty so long he had forgotten what water was, and had just now by accident been handed a glass. He was a man who had been seen by everyone and known by almost no one, and the longer he sat beside the sleeping woman who had not asked, the more he understood that he had been waiting for her, or someone like her, for half his life. The plane began its descent into a grey dawn, and the seatbelt chime woke Eli, and the boy sat up rubbing his eyes and looked out the window at the city tilting up to meet them, the grid of lights going pale as the sun came, the rivers turning from black to pewter. And he watched it with the open wonder of a child who has not yet learned to pretend he has seen everything. Then he turned to his mother and said, with the total certainty of the very young, "Are we going to fix my heart now?" Rennie smoothed his hair and said, "Soon, baby, soon." And the boy nodded and went back to the window, satisfied. The way children are satisfied when the people who love them say, "soon," because to a child soon is a promise and not a delay. Across the armrest, Walter Hesh closed his eyes for a moment as though the words had cost him something, and his hand, resting on his own knee, closed slowly into a loose fist, and then opened again, and Renee, had she been watching, might have wondered at it. She was not watching. She was looking at her son, looking at the world, which was the only view she ever really wanted. What happened next happened slowly, the way the most important things do. They came off the jet bridge into the noise of the arrivals hall, and Renee was already shifting back into the woman she had to be on the ground, the one who counted exits and calculated the cab fare she could not pay, and wondered if the airport train ran to the hospital district. Walter walked beside her without seeming to decide to. At the bottom of the escalator he stopped, and he took out the worn leather wallet, and Renee felt her whole body go tight, because here it was, the part where the kindness turned out to have a price after all, the part where he handed her a card and a number and a look she would have to manage. Walter did not hand her money. He handed her a business card, plain, just a name and a phone number, and the name on it was his full name. And Renee read it, and her face did not change, because the name meant nothing to her. Walter watched her not recognize him, and something in his shoulders eased. "If you ever need anything for the boy," he said, "you call that number, not the office. That one. It rings to me." Renee looked at the card, then she looked at the man. And because she was who she was, she said the thing that no one in 20 years had said to Walter Hesh. She said, "That's kind of you, but we'll be all right. I didn't tell you about Eli so you'd help. I told you because you asked, and nobody asks." And she put the card in her coat pocket, the way you pocket a thing you intend to be polite about and never use. And she took her son's hand and walked toward the train, and Walter Hesh stood at the bottom of the escalator and watched her go, and felt, for the first time in longer than he could name, like he had been given something instead of asked for it. He did not let her disappear. He was a man who had built an empire on knowing when not to let a thing go. The surgery was scheduled for a Tuesday, and the week before it, Renee sat at the little table in the apartment she sublet from a woman at church and spread out the bills the way you spread out cards you already know are losing. The table wobbled on a short leg she had never fixed, propped with a folded square of cardboard, and she had eaten 10,000 meals at it and paid 1,000 bills at it, and it had held them all. The hospital had sent the estimate, 6 pages of it, the codes and the line items and the small print that turned a child's heart into a column of numbers. Even with the insurance, even with the charity application, she had filled out in handwriting that got smaller and more careful toward the bottom of the page. The number at the end was a number she would be paying for the rest of her working life, if they let her start a payment plan at all, and if they did not, the surgery did not happen. And if the surgery did not happen, the small flaw in the wiring of her son's heart would do what small flaws do in time. She had run the math 4 times. She ran it a 5th, as though the 5th time the numbers might take pity. They did not. She had a jar on the counter with grocery money in it, 1s and a few 5s, and she had counted that too, and the jar and the surgery were not in the same universe of numbers, and she knew it. She put her face in her hands. She did not cry because Eli was asleep in the next room and the walls were thin, and she had a rule about him hearing her cry. She breathed in for 4 counts. She held it. She let it go. And her eye fell on her coat, hung over the back of the chair, and on the corner of a plain white card sticking out of the pocket. She almost didn't. That is the part people never believe, but it is true. She almost let the card stay in the pocket because asking was the one thing her pride had never let her do, and a stranger from an airplane was not a thing you called, and surely a man like that had forgotten her by now, a tired woman and a boy among the thousands he must meet. She picked the card up and turned it over in her fingers and set it down again. She made a cup of tea. She did not drink. She sat with the card in her hand for a long time, and the apartment ticked and settled around her. And through the thin wall she could hear Eli's breathing, even and steady, the breathing she had once watched a machine perform for him. Then she thought about Eli asking if they were going to fix his heart now, and she understood that there were things a mother's pride did not get to keep, and she dialed the number, and it rang twice. And a voice she knew said hello. "Walter," she said, "it's Renee, from the plane." I have a son named Eli. You said to call." There was a silence on the line, and then Walter Hesh said, in a voice that was not quite steady, "I have been hoping you would." What she did not know, what she would not learn until later, was that Walter had called the airline the day after the flight and learned nothing, because they would not give him her name, and that he had spent 2 weeks unable to find a tired woman and a boy in a city of millions, and that he had sat by his own phone the way she had sat by her bills, waiting for a call he had given up the right to expect. He did not write a check. That is the second thing people never believe. A man with $19 billion, and he did not simply pay the bill and vanish because he had learned, the hard way, 20 years ago, that money handed down from a height does not heal the thing it touches, it only buries it. Instead, he asked her where the surgery was, and when, and the name of the specialist 3 states away, and then he asked if he could be there. Not to pay, he said, to be there. Renee did not understand, but she was too tired to refuse a kindness that asked nothing, and she said, yes. He flew to the city the day before the surgery, and he came to the hospital in the same grey sweater, and he sat in the waiting room beside Renee for 9 hours, while the surgeon's hands did delicate work inside her son's chest. The waiting room was the kind Renee knew well, the vinyl chairs the colour of nothing, the television bolted high in the corner, playing a cooking show no one watched, the coffee machine that took your dollar and gave you a thin brown apology. She had done this before, alone the first time, when Eli was an infant, and she had sat in a room like this with no one's hand to hold and had counted the ceiling tiles until the numbers stopped meaning anything. This time a man sat beside her. He did not check his phone. He did not take a single call, though it rang, and rang in his pocket. A sound she would later learn was a board of directors and 3 lawyers, and a deal worth more than the hospital itself, all of it ringing and ringing while Walter Hesh sat in a plastic chair and held a paper cup of bad coffee and waited with a woman he had met on a plane. Once, around the 4th hour, she told him he could take the call if he needed to, and he looked at the phone as though it belonged to someone else and put it back in his pocket and said, "There is nothing on this phone more important than that door." And he nodded at the double doors. The surgeon would come through, and Renee believed him, and she did not know yet how completely true it was. They did not talk much. There was not much to say that the waiting did not already say for them. At the 6th hour, Renee got up and walked the same stiff-legged loop she had walked on the plane, down to the window at the end of the hall and back, and when she returned, Walter had bought from somewhere 2 sandwiches in triangles of plastic, and he handed her one without a word, the way you hand food to family. And she ate it because he was right that she needed to, and the small ordinary kindness of it nearly undid her more than any grand gesture could have. At the 8th hour, a different family came in, loud with fear, and Walter gave up his seat so the grandmother could sit, and stood against the wall for the last hour, with his hands in the pockets of the grey sweater, and Renee watched him do it and understood that whoever this man was, he was the same in an empty terminal and a crowded waiting room. Kind when he thought no one was keeping score, which is the only kindness that ever counts. The surgeon came out at the 9th hour with the careful neutral face surgeons wear, and Renee stood up so fast the world tilted, and the surgeon said the words she had been praying for, that it had gone well, that the small flaw was repaired, that the boy was in recovery, and the boy was going to be fine. And Renee Carter, who did not cry where her son could hear, sat back down in the plastic chair and put her face in her hands and finally let herself, and Walter Hesh put one hand on her shoulder and said nothing at all, because he had learned that too, that the kindest thing is often the quietest, that sometimes you do not fill the silence, you just stay inside it with the person who is breaking. The bill came 3 weeks later and it said paid in full, and there was no name on it. Renee called the number. Walter answered. She said the hospital says it's paid. I didn't agree to that, and Walter said, I know, you didn't ask. And that is why. And then he told her the thing he had not told her on the plane, the thing he had been carrying the whole time, which was that 20 years ago his own son had been born too early, 8 weeks too early, small enough to fit in 2 cupped hands, and that the machine had breathed for that boy too, and that the boy had not lived, and that Walter had been a poor man then with no card to hand anyone and no number that rang to him, and that he had stood at the glass of an incubator and made promises to a God he was not sure he believed in and lost anyway. and that he had spent 20 years building enough money to make sure no one ever stood at that glass helpless again, and had never once found a way to give it that did not feel like power instead of grace, until a tired woman on a delayed flight told him about a boy with a flaw in the wiring of his heart and never once asked him for a thing. "You gave me the chance to keep a promise," Walter said. The bill was the smallest part of it. The smallest part, by far. Renee did not have words. She held the phone and she looked through the doorway at Eli, asleep, with one foot hanging off the bed, his small chest rising and falling, the wiring fixed, the desk erased, and she understood that she had been carrying a man's 20-year grief across an airplane aisle without knowing it, and that her son's life had been bound up with a stranger's dead son in a way no one could have planned, and that the world was not as deaf as it had spent 34 years seeming. There was one more thing, and it came on a Tuesday, the way the surgery had. A letter arrived at the apartment on heavy paper from a foundation Renee had never heard of. It was the kind of envelope that usually meant trouble, thick and formal, and she opened it, standing at the counter with her coat still on, braced for a collections notice or a denied appeal, because those were the letters her life had trained her to expect. It was neither. It said that she had been selected. It said that the foundation funded the parents of children with congenital heart conditions, paid not only their medical costs but a living stipend, because the foundation's founder believed that a mother sitting by a sick child should not also be doing arithmetic about rent. It said the support would continue until Eli was grown, that there would be money for the checkups 3 states away and the gas to get there, and the nights in a motel near the hospital, and that she would never again have to choose between her son's heart and the light bill. Renee read it twice, standing there, her coat still on, sure there was a catch in the small print, a thing they would ask of her in return. There was no catch. And at the bottom, in a line of small type, it named the foundation, and the foundation was named for a boy, and the boy's last name was Hesh. Renee sat down very slowly at the little table where she had once spread out her losing cards, the table with the short leg propped on cardboard, and she understood at last who had sat beside her on the plane. She had not asked. Across all those hours, she had not asked who he was, and that not asking had been the thing that opened every door. She called the number one last time, and Walter answered, and she could not speak for a moment, and then she said only his name, the whole of it, the name from the card, the name from the building she had walked past 1,000 times, the name of the boy at the bottom of the letter. And Walter Hesh on the other end of the line, in an office at the top of a tower, with a deal worth more than a hospital closed and forgotten on his desk, heard a hospital cafeteria worker say his son's name out loud for the first time in 20 years, and finally wept. Here is the part the world likes to skip, so stay with it. He did not make her grateful in the way the very rich usually require. He did not invite her to a gala or put her on a stage or ask her to tell her story to a room of donors so they could feel the warmth of having helped. He did the opposite. He kept calling the plane number, the one that rang to him, and he asked about Eli's checkups, and he sent the boy a book about airplanes for his 7th birthday with no return address. And once a year, on the anniversary of the flight, he flew to whatever city Renee was in and took her and Eli to a diner. A real one, with red vinyl booths and bad coffee and pie that came in slices too big to finish. He let the boy order whatever he wanted, and Eli always ordered the same thing, a grilled cheese and a chocolate milkshake and onion rings he never finished, and Walter always pretended to be scandalized by the milkshake, and then ordered one himself. The two of them would sit on one side of the booth, the old man and the boy, and Renee would sit on the other and watch them, and Walter would ask Eli about school and airplanes, and the questions Eli was currently driving his teachers crazy with, and he listened to the answers the way he had listened on the plane, as though they were the only thing in the diner worth his attention. He never once mentioned the money because the money had never been the point. The point was a booth and a boy with a strong heart and a slice of pie too big to finish and a man who had finally found something he could give that did not feel like power. Once when Eli was 9, he asked Walter why he always wore the same grey sweater, and Walter looked down at it as though he had forgotten he had it on, and he said that it was the sweater he had been wearing on the best day of his life, and he would not say which day, and he winked at the boy and Renee across the booth, knew exactly which day he meant, and said nothing, and stirred her coffee and let the warmth of it sit in her chest where she kept the things too large to say out loud. Diane Fall, the woman in the cream silk blouse, heard the story eventually, the way stories travel through the floors of a company, carried up the elevators and across the open-plan desks until they reached everyone who was not there. She heard that the woman on the plane, the one she had warned Walter about, the one she had been so sure was angling for something, had been the only person in 20 years to never angle for anything at all. She heard it in a hallway, second-hand, from a younger colleague who did not know Diane had been on that flight, and she did not say anything, and she went back to her office and closed the door. And what she felt sitting there with the door closed was not for Renee to know and not for us to judge. She thought perhaps of her own warning. You have to watch for it, I'm sure. She has quite a story ready, and of how the man had turned to the window and said she hasn't asked me for a single thing, and how she had spent the rest of that flight certain she had seen something he had missed, when in fact it was the other way around. Some lessons arrive without an audience, and those are often the ones that take. Years later, when Eli was a tall teenager with a strong heart and a habit of asking too many questions, he asked his mother why the old man in the grey sweater had helped them when they were strangers, when she had never even asked. And Renee thought about how to answer, and she told him the truth, which was that she did not know, not really, not all of it. And then she told him this. She said that there are people in the world who spend their whole lives being looked at and never once being seen, and there are people who spend their whole lives being seen and never once being known, and that sometimes, if you are very lucky, the two of them end up sitting next to each other on a delayed flight. And one of them is tired enough and decent enough to be kind without keeping score, and the other one is kind enough not to ask for anything, and in the space between them, something gets healed that neither one could have healed alone. Ellie did not fully understand it. Then he would, later. If you have ever been the person nobody looked at twice, the one who held the door and refilled the coffee and was thanked without anyone meeting your eyes, this story was for you, and I want you to know that the world keeps a longer memory than it lets on. Tell me about a time someone was kind to you when they thought no one was keeping score. I read them. The card is still in Renee's wallet, soft now and gone grey at the corners, the plain white card with a name and a number that rings to a man who once lost a son and spent 20 years learning how to give. She does not call it often. She does not need to. Still, she keeps it where she can find it, the way you keep the proof of a thing, too large to hold. And on quiet nights when Eli is asleep with one foot still hanging off the bed the way he has since he was 6, she takes it out and looks at it, and she breathes in for 4 counts, and she holds it, and she lets it go.